Hey guys, welcome back to the Atlas Archives. Tonight we're heading to a country with an inland sea full of sharks, a volcano with a permanent lake of lava sitting right there in its crater like a stovetop nobody ever turned off, and a capital city so nervous about being flattened again that it simply refuses to have a downtown. We're talking about Nicaragua. Yes, sharks. Actual bull sharks cruising around a freshwater lake in the middle of Central America, nowhere near the ocean, having apparently decided a few centuries back that salt water was overrated. We'll get to how that happened. We'll get to the volcano so young it's basically a geological teenager, still growing, still throwing tantrums. And we'll get to the canal that almost wasn't Panama's at all, the one that nearly rerouted global shipping straight through a lake instead. So here's what I want you to do. Dim the lights, get horizontal, let your eyes go soft, and just listen. If you've got a second before you drift off, drop a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from tonight. I read every single one, and it's genuinely one of my favourite parts of doing this. And if you're new here, consider subscribing, because we do this every week, one country at a time, until we've covered basically the whole planet. Alright, lights down. Let's start with the ground itself, because in Nicaragua, the ground has some very strong opinions about staying still. Chapter 1. Land of Lakes and Fire. Let's start with the shape of the place, because Nicaragua has a strange one. It's the biggest country in Central America by a comfortable margin, about 129,000 square kilometers, roughly the size of New York State, if New York had two enormous lakes bolted to its chest and a chain of volcanoes running down one side like a zipper. On a map it looks tidy, a rough triangle wedged between Honduras and Costa Rica, but zoom in and something odd shows up. Most of the country's 6+ million people are squeezed onto a narrow strip along the Pacific coast, while the interior, more than half the landmass, is close to empty. It's less one country than a crowded apartment with an enormous backyard nobody bothered to landscape. Here's the math, and it's more extreme than it sounds. More than 60% of Nicaraguans live on the Pacific side, in a strip so narrow you could bike across it in an afternoon if the hills weren't so rude about it. Push into the Caribbean lowlands, which cover over half the entire country, and you're down to less than 1 in 10 Nicaraguans. Geographers will cite volcanic soil, trade routes, rainfall, all correct. But the short version is, everyone crowded onto the strip where the ground occasionally tries to kill you, and left the calm, soaked, fertile half of the country to the jaguars. That strip is worth pausing on, because it isn't just crowded, it's sitting on a seam in the Earth's crust. Run your eye down the Pacific side, and you're tracing what geologists call the Cordillera de los Maribios, a chain of volcanoes strung together like beads on a string nobody asked for. This is where the Cocos Plate slides underneath the Caribbean Plate, grinding along a few centimeters a year. Slow until you remember it's been doing that for millions of years with no sign of stopping. The result is one of the most active volcanic chains on the planet, crammed into a stretch of coastline you could drive in a single day. Nicaraguans built their biggest cities right along it anyway, not despite the volcanoes, alongside them, sometimes practically in their shadow. Take Momotombo, rising near the shore of Lake Managua like a postcard that occasionally detonates. It's young as volcanoes go, only around 4,500 years old, basically a toddler throwing rocks. It sat quiet for over a century, long enough that people probably stopped flinching every time they looked at it. And then, in December of 2015, it erupted again, just to remind everyone it was still around. Its silhouette is the kind of perfect symmetrical cone you'd draw if a child asked you to draw. A volcano steep sides, a neat crater on top, framed against the lake like it's posing for a tourism poster, which, frankly, It is. Momotombo shows up on postcards, paintings and murals across the country the volcano Nicaragua uses to advertise itself. A genuinely bold branding choice for something that erupts. And here's the detail that properly delighted me while researching this. Momotombo is famous enough in literature that Victor Hugo, the Les Miserables one, wrote a whole poem about it without ever setting foot in Nicaragua. He'd heard a second-hand missionary legend about Spanish priests marching up the mountain to baptize it and never coming back down, and he ran with it from an ocean away. Somewhere in Nicaragua, a teenage poet named Rubén Darío, future author of some of the language's most celebrated poetry, read Hugo's version and was mildly annoyed. A Frenchman who'd never seen the volcano got to write the definitive take on it. So decades later, having actually stood in front of the thing, Darío wrote his own. Either a lovely literary tribute or the 1800s version of a subtweet, possibly both. Not far away sits Masaya, and it's been showing off since before Nicaragua had a name anyone here would recognize. When Spanish conquistadors first arrived, Masaya happened to be erupting, handing those Europeans their first ever glimpse of an honest-to-goodness lava lake molten rock just sitting there, glowing, uncovered, like the planet forgot to put a lid on something. Understandably, a few of the more religious conquistadors assumed they'd found the mouth of hell, which, fair. Masaya's lava lake comes and goes across the centuries, but it's been active again since around 2015, and today it's one of only a small handful of permanent lava lakes on Earth. You can drive right up to the crater rim today and stare down into it, an incredible privilege or a genuinely terrible life decision, depending on your relationship with lava. Then there's Cerro Negro, the baby of the family. It was born in April of 1850, younger than the sewing machine, and dramatically younger than most of the churches Nicaraguans still worship in today. It's erupted roughly 23 times since punching up out of the ground, making it one of the most active volcanoes in the region, and it's still just a stark, bare cone of black ash with almost nothing growing on it because nothing's had time to. These days, people strap wooden boards to their feet and slide down it for fun, a sport charmingly known as volcano boarding. It's not respect the volcano, it's, well, the volcano's right there, may as well. Now, volcanoes aside, the single most defining feature of this country is water, specifically Lake Nicaragua, which locals call Cocibolca, the Sweet Sea. Sweet is right. At roughly 8,264 square kilometers, it's the largest lake in Central America and the 19th largest on the entire planet, sitting a mere 32 meters above sea level and connected to the Caribbean by the San Juan River. Picture a genuine inland ocean, big enough that early Spanish explorers reportedly mistook it for the Pacific itself. It's ringed with volcanoes, dotted with tiny islands, and for centuries it's functioned less like a lake and more like the country's actual highway system, moving goods and people long before anyone paved a road. But the lake's real claim to fame isn't its size, it's what's swimming in it. Because Lake Nicaragua is one of the only freshwater lakes on Earth with a resident breeding population of actual sharks. Bull sharks, specifically the same species behind most of the shark encounters people worry about at the beach, living, hunting and reproducing hundreds of kilometers from any ocean. For a long time, locals figured these were a unique species found nowhere else. And honestly, who could blame them? Turns out bull sharks are just unusually good at handling fresh water, capable of flushing salt from their systems well enough to survive it long term. And these ones swim up the San Juan River from the Caribbean, apparently leaping the rapids the way salmon do, on pure stubbornness. Then they just stay. Somewhere along the way, a population of ocean predators looked at Central America's biggest lake and decided, yeah, actually, this works now. Sitting in the middle of all that shark-adjacent water is Ometepe, an island shaped like a figure eight because it's two volcanoes that grew close enough to fuse into one landmass. Concepcion is the taller, livelier twin, about 1,610 meters, still active, still occasionally reminding everyone it could ruin their week. Madeira's is the quieter sibling, dormant, its slopes wrapped in cloud forest instead of raw ash, hiding petroglyphs carved by people who lived there long before anyone wrote anything down. Together they make Ometepe the largest volcanic island inside a freshwater lake anywhere in the world, a wonderfully specific superlative that also happens to be true. People live there, farm there, raise families in the saddle between two volcanoes, one of which could technically erupt, with a shrug that says they made peace with it generations ago. Cocibolca has a smaller, less glamorous sister up north called Lake Managua, or Xolotlan by its older name, covering a little over 1,000 square kilometers beside the capital city that shares its name. Unlike its big sibling, Xolotlan doesn't drain to the Caribbean, so whatever ends up in it stays in it for decades. That meant an alarming amount of industrial runoff and raw sewage, though cleanup efforts have chipped away at that since. It sits close enough to Momotombo that on a clear day you can watch the volcano's reflection on the water, checking itself out. It's the quieter of the two big lakes. No sharks to speak of, but it's had a front row seat to the thing that really defines the capital beside it, the ground refusing to stay still. Because Managua has been levelled, not damaged. Levelled twice within living memory of the same century. In 1931, an earthquake tore through the city and flattened huge sections of it, and the city clawed its way back, rebuilt, dusted itself off. Then, on the night of December 23rd, 1972, it happened again. A quake that clocked in at a seemingly modest 6.2, but struck so shallow that the number barely mattered. Thousands of people died. Something like 300,000 were left without homes, in a city whose population wasn't much bigger than the number it had just displaced. Buildings that survived 1931 didn't survive round two. The city centre ceased to exist in a single night, right before Christmas, about as cruel a piece of timing as history hands out. And here's the part that still surprises visitors. Managua never really rebuilt that centre. Planners looked at the wreckage and made a call. The old downtown sat on ground too, seismically nervous to trust with skyscrapers or government buildings again, so the city spread itself sideways, scattering commerce and offices across the metro area like nobody trusted any one spot enough to commit to it twice. Decades later, Managua is one of the only national capitals on Earth without a real downtown, no central business district, no historic old town to stroll through, just a low, sprawling city with a hollowed-out patch near the lake where the old cathedral still stands, roofless, a shell nobody quite had the heart to finish tearing down or repairing, less a ruin than a very large, very public shrug. Here's the geographic irony nobody expects. For roughly 4 centuries, Nicaragua, not Panama, was everyone's first choice for cutting a canal across the Americas. The logic makes sense once you see the map. Nicaragua offered a nearly complete water route sitting there for free, the San Juan River connecting straight to Lake Nicaragua, leaving only a short stretch of land between lake and Pacific to dig. Spanish officials floated the idea as early as the 1500s. The newly independent Central American Republic commissioned serious surveys by 1825. France's Napoleon III took an interest decades later. Even Cornelius Vanderbilt got involved, and not just on paper. In the 1850s he ran an actual working transit company, ferrying thousands of gold rush travellers across Nicaragua by boat and stagecoach toward California. years before anyone broke ground in Panama at all. So why did Panama end up with the canal, leaving Nicaragua as a very good trivia answer instead? Money, politics, and depending which version you like best, a postage stamp. By 1890, engineers had started actual dredging along the San Juan River, and by 1899 the United States formed a commission to weigh Nicaragua against Panama. Panama's backers, keen to close the deal, reportedly mailed senators a Nicaraguan postage stamp depicting Momotombo mid-eruption, smoke and all, as a gentle reminder of what building beside an active volcano might involve. Historians still argue how much that stamp swung the vote, but in 1902 the US chose Panama, bought out the French assets already sitting there, and Nicaragua's centuries-old head start quietly evaporated. The world's most famous canal exists where it does, partly because of a volcano's public relations problem. While all that unfolded on the Pacific side, the Caribbean coast was living an almost entirely separate story, because Spain barely bothered with it. The interior and Pacific fell under Spanish control in the 1500s, but the Caribbean lowlands home to the Miskito people ended up under British influence instead, starting in the 1600s, with England eventually backing an entire Miskito monarchy, crowned king and all. Two coasts of one country, colonized by two different empires, speaking different languages, worshipping in different churches. That divide never fully closed. Even now, English, Miskito and Creole are spoken across the Caribbean side alongside Spanish. The population includes Creole, Garifuna, Rama, and Mayangna communities barely present on the Pacific side. And the region only rejoined Nicaragua politically well into the 1800s, kicking and screaming, long after independence had happened everywhere else. And behind all of it, the volcanoes, the lakes, the shark-infested Sweet Sea, and two coastlines that barely speak the same cultural language sits Bosawaz, a rainforest so vast it swallows roughly 15% of the country. Around 20,000 square kilometers of unbroken canopy, one of the largest stretches of tropical rainforest north of the Amazon, home to jaguars, tapirs, harpy eagles, and indigenous communities who've lived inside it far longer than anyone's bothered to count. It's the wild, waterlogged, barely mapped heart of a country that likes keeping its biggest secrets in the middle, which is exactly where we're headed next, because long before Spanish sails appeared on that horizon, this land already belonged to people with their own kingdoms, their own gods, and their own names for every one of these volcanoes. That story starts now. Chapter 2. The Land Before the Map. Long before anyone called this place Nicaragua, it was already spoken for. Several times over, in fact, by people who had absolutely no interest in sharing. If you'd stood on the shores of Lake Cocibolca sometime around the year 800, you wouldn't have found empty wilderness waiting patiently for a Spanish sailing ship to show up and give it a name. You'd have found farms, temples, marketplaces, and at least 2 or 3 separate peoples who each considered the others foreign, suspicious, and possibly beneath them. This was not one kingdom quietly waiting to be discovered. It was a patchwork of rival chiefdoms, jammed together around the same lakes and volcanoes we spent our last chapter admiring, each one convinced it had the better gods, the better pottery, and the better cacao. Keep that patchwork in mind. It's going to matter enormously later, in ways that will make you want to reach back through time and shake somebody by the shoulders, because nothing in this chapter is a prelude to some grand, unified Nicaraguan civilization. It's the opposite. It's a crowded room full of proud, stubborn, entirely separate households, all about to get a very unwelcome visitor. The first of these peoples to arrive, as far as archaeologists can tell, were the Chorotega, migrating south out of the Mexican highlands around the 8th century and settling into the fertile crescent that runs through modern Rivas, Granada and Masaya. They spoke Mangay, a language in the Otomangayan family that had travelled with them all the way from central Mexico, and they left their fingerprints on the map in a way that's honestly kind of delightful. Masaya, Managua, Nicoya, all Chorotega words still sitting on official signage centuries after the language itself went extinct. It's a bit like finding out your neighbourhood was named by people whose native tongue nobody alive can actually speak anymore, and nobody thought to change it. The Chorotega were skilled farmers, working maize, beans and squash out of volcanic soil that, as we already established, has a nasty habit of erupting. But they're best remembered today for their pottery. Vivid, intricate, covered in jaguars and mythological creatures, the kind of craftsmanship that museums still fight over. Then, centuries later, came the Nicarao. And here's where things get genuinely interesting. Because the Nicarao weren't just neighbours of the Chorotega, they were practically cousins of the Aztec, at least linguistically. The Nicarao spoke a Nahuan language, closely related to Nahuatl, the tongue of the Toltecs and the Mexica up in central Mexico, which means these people had migrated an almost absurd distance south, settling around Lake Nicaragua and the Rivas Isthmus sometime between the years 1300 and 1525. Think about that migration for a second. That's roughly the distance from New York to Panama, on foot, through jungle, with no rental cars and no rest stops. And when they got here, they didn't just squat quietly next to the Chorotega. They built towns that would later become the literal foundations of León, Granada, Managua, and Chinandega, the very cities whose ruins and earthquakes we talked about last chapter. The Spanish didn't found those cities so much as move into apartments the Nicarao had already furnished. Now, the Nicarao ran on chocolate, not casually either. Cacao beans functioned as actual currency, a system so practical that Spanish colonists later kept using it themselves, because why invent new money when the locals already had a perfectly good one that grew on trees? One of the major Nicarao settlements near Rivas was called Cacahuatan, which translates roughly to land of cacao water, a reference to the ceremonial chocolate drinks that were central to Nicarao life the way coffee is central to yours, except with considerably more religious weight attached. Cacao moved along extensive trade networks that also carried obsidian, the volcanic glass mined from sources hundreds of kilometres away and shaped into blades sharp enough to make a modern surgeon nervous. Picture an economy where your currency is delicious, your money literally grows on trees, and your knives come from volcanoes. It's the kind of setup that sounds almost too good, which, if you've been paying attention to how these stories usually go, should make you immediately suspicious. And you'd be right to be suspicious, because the Nicarao also played a version of the Mesoamerican ball game, and this was not recreational basketball. Ball courts have been found at thousands of sites stretching from central Mexico down through Nicaragua, and archaeologists studying the iconography at some of these courts have connected the ritual, in certain contexts, to decapitation. Not every match ended that way, presumably, or nobody would have signed up for the league, but the association was strong enough and consistent enough across the region that historians take it seriously. So next time you complain about your fantasy football commissioner, remember it could be worse. He could be running the league on the honour system with an actual blade. Archaeologists have now catalogued over 2,000 of these courts scattered between central Mexico and Nicaragua, which tells you the game wasn't some regional curiosity. It was practically the Mesoamerican national sport, several centuries running, trophies optional. The Nicarao cosmology ran deep and specific, sharing plenty of DNA with the beliefs of their distant Nahua relatives up north. Heart sacrifice, a ritual calendar, and a pantheon that included Hecatl, a wind god, and Quetzalcoatl, who handled the rain, which, given how much this region depends on its wet season, was probably a very popular deity to keep on your good side. Jaguars showed up constantly in their art and belief, standing in for power both political and supernatural, which makes sense. Nobody's putting a possum on their ceremonial pottery as a symbol of dominance. This was a coherent, sophisticated worldview, built over centuries, and it was still very much alive and functioning when a very different worldview came walking up the beach. That worldview arrived in the person of Gil González Dávila, a Spanish captain who marched north out of what's now Costa Rica in the year 1523 and found himself face to face with the region's most powerful cacique, a ruler whose territory stretched from Rivas all the way into what's now Guanacaste in Costa Rica. And here's the detail that should stop you in your tracks. That ruler's actual name, according to later scholarship, was Macuilmichuistli. The Spanish, apparently unwilling or unable to wrestle with that mouthful, simplified it down to something they could pronounce, Nicarao. And from Nicarao, allegedly, came Nicaragua. An entire nation's name, possibly, is a linguistic shortcut the Spanish took because the real name was too much work. What happened next between these two men has actually earned its own nickname among historians, who called it the Dialogue of Centuries, and it deserves the title. For 8 straight days this cacique interrogated González Dávila about Christian theology, and chroniclers recorded some of his actual questions. He wanted to know, among other things, whether the Spanish God had ever sent a great flood to destroy every man and animal on earth. Sit with that for a second. A Mesoamerican ruler, meeting Europeans for the first time, independently probing for a flood myth, and finding one because it turns out an astonishing number of unrelated cultures across the planet have some version of that same story buried in their traditions. It's one of those genuinely eerie coincidences of human mythology, and it happened right here on the shores of a lake we've already spent an entire chapter admiring. Whatever else you want to say about the collision that was coming, it's worth pausing on the fact that this first real exchange wasn't a massacre. For 8 days it was just two very different men, asking each other surprisingly similar questions about the end of the world. Of course, this being history, the tidy version doesn't survive close inspection. The country's name might not even come from the chief at all. Some linguists argue Nicaragua actually derives from a Nahuatl phrase, something closer to Nicanawak, meaning here, near the water, a description of the lakes rather than a tribute to any individual ruler, which would mean the popular story we all learned, the noble cacique whose name became a nation, might just be a folk etymology that got repeated so often it calcified into fact. Either way, the debate matters less than what it reveals. Even the most basic fact about this country, its own name, comes with an asterisk and a footnote, and honestly, that tracks perfectly with everything else we're about to cover. Because make no mistake, the Nicarao and the Chorotega were not one happy confederation sharing recipes and pottery techniques over a friendly fire. They were rival powers, distinct in language, origin, and often outright hostility, competing for the same fertile land ringing the same lakes. Add in cultural and territorial friction that occasionally spilled into violence, with stronger groups displacing weaker ones and splintering them into smaller factions, and you start to see the real texture of this place before Europeans ever arrived. This wasn't a single civilization. It was something closer to ancient Greece, a collection of proudly independent city-states that happened to share a coastline, a religion in rough outline, and a deep, mutual suspicion of each other's ambitions. Now, all of this so far has been happening down on the Pacific side, which, as you'll remember from our very first chapter, is where the vast majority of Nicaragua's population has always clustered. But head inland, up into the central highlands, and you meet an entirely different set of neighbours. The Matagalpa people occupied this rugged, forested interior, speaking a language belonging to the Misumalpan family, a linguistic group found nowhere in Mesoamerica proper. Their language has since gone extinct as a spoken tongue, surviving mostly in place names and scholarly reconstruction, even as tens of thousands of people today still identify as Matagalpa by ethnicity and heritage. It's a strange kind of survival. The community endures. The words that once described their world quietly slipped away. Further into the highlands and along the headwaters feeding toward the Caribbean, you'd find the people history books used to call the Sumu, though that label was never actually theirs. It was slapped on them by outsiders and colonial record keepers, and the people it describes have always called themselves something else entirely, the Mayangna, which translates roughly to, "We are of the sun." Their remote, difficult-to-reach territory, tucked along river systems deep in the interior, turned out to be an accidental blessing. While coastal and lakeside peoples absorbed direct contact with Spanish forces for centuries, the Mayangna's isolation let them hold on to their language and their way of organizing society with a continuity that few other groups in the region can claim. Sometimes the best defense against conquest is simply being extremely difficult to find. But if you really want the strangest origin story in this entire chapter, you need to travel all the way to the Caribbean coast, because the Miskito people, unlike everyone we've discussed so far, didn't actually exist yet. Not in this form. Their story as a distinct people begins later, and it begins violently. In the year 1640, according to the most repeated account, a ship carrying enslaved Africans wrecked near Cape Gracias a Dios, on the border between what's now Nicaragua and Honduras, following a rebellion aboard the vessel. The survivors made it to shore and began integrating with the indigenous people already living there. Whether that's the literal, precise sequence of events, or a story sharpened by generations of retelling, historians still argue, but the result on the ground was undeniable and permanent. Out of that collision came the Miskito Sambu, sometimes written Zambo, a people of mixed African and indigenous ancestry who built an entire coastal identity around canoes, turtle hunting, and an increasingly close partnership with English-speaking traders and privateers eager for allies against the Spanish. And the balance of power inside Miskito society shifted hard in their direction. By the early 1700s, the Sambu faction hadn't just joined the Miskito world, they were running it, with the kingship itself settling into Sambu hands. It's a genuinely remarkable origin story, a people forged from shipwreck, rebellion and alliance rather than ancient migration, and it explains why the Caribbean coast would go on to feel and function like an almost entirely separate country from the Pacific side for the next several hundred years. So picture the whole board as it stood on the eve of real, sustained European contact. Nahua-speaking Nicarao chiefdoms clustered around Rivas and the Great Lake, running on cacao and obsidian. Chorotega communities scattered through Granada and Masaya, their pottery outliving their spoken language by centuries. Matagalpa farmers working the central highlands. Mayangna communities tucked into river valleys nobody could easily reach. And out along the Caribbean, a brand new people just beginning to take shape from the wreckage of one truly terrible night at sea. No emperor, no single throne, no one army that could unite this land or defend all of it at once. Just proud, separate, occasionally warring peoples who had spent centuries building rich, distinct civilizations on top of the same volcanic soil. which is exactly the kind of situation a small, determined, well-armed group of outsiders tends to find absolutely irresistible. And the 8 days Gil Gonzalez Davila had already spent asking a cacique about floods and gods were only the opening handshake. The rest of that particular introduction is a great deal less polite, and it's coming up next. Chapter 3. Conquest, Cities, and the Cruelest Trade in the Americas. So, remember that 8-day theological debate we just wrapped up? The one where a Spanish captain and a Nicaraguan cacique sat around comparing flood myths like two guys who'd just discovered they went to rival colleges? That was Gil Gonzalez Davila being polite. It didn't last. Once the conversation about gods and floods ran its course, Gonzalez Davila got down to the actual business he'd sailed north for. And that business was gold, land, and souls. Roughly in that order of enthusiasm. The diplomacy evaporated fast. Within weeks his expedition was burning towns that hadn't signed up for the flood myth chat, and the man who'd spent over a week patiently trading cosmological opinions with one cacique was now marching through the territory of several others with a considerably shorter attention span for debate. History has a pattern for this. Whenever a conquest starts with a polite theological chat, budget for the sequel being considerably less philosophical. Here's the number that gets repeated so often it's basically become his professional headline. Gonzalez Davila claimed to have converted somewhere around 32,000 indigenous people to Christianity during this campaign. Take that figure with the same grain of salt you'd take any self-reported statistic from a man justifying an invasion to his king. Some of those conversions were genuine, cacique to cacique, robe and cross, traded for continued goodwill. A great many more were baptisms performed at the point of a sword, on people with approximately zero interest in switching religions but a very clear interest in not being killed that afternoon. And running alongside all that spiritual bookkeeping was a simpler operation. Looting. Gold ornaments, ceremonial pieces, anything that glinted, got melted down and shipped south. The Spanish crown didn't care how many souls you'd saved. It cared how much of that gold showed up in the ledger. By 1524, a new name enters the story, and it's one that's still on Nicaraguan money today. Francisco Hernandez de Córdoba. He was dispatched north from Panama by his boss, a governor named Pedro Arias Davila, universally known as Pedro Arias, and even more universally known, at a safe whisper, as Pedro Arias the Cruel. That nickname wasn't earned through gentle governance. Pedro Arias had a well-documented habit of eliminating rivals, real or imagined, which is a detail you should file away right now, because it comes back around before this chapter is over. Hernandez de Córdoba's job was to consolidate what Gonzalez Davila had started, plant permanent Spanish settlements, and turn a smash-and-grab expedition into an actual colony. He was good at his job. That, unfortunately, was also about to become a problem. The first thing Hernandez de Córdoba built was Granada, established in 1524 on the shores of Lake Nicaragua, on or near an existing indigenous town called Jalteva. The location wasn't an accident. Granada sat on a lake that connected, via the San Juan River, all the way out to the Caribbean Sea, which meant a merchant there could ship cacao, indigo, or looted silver straight towards Spain without ever touching an overland trail. That river access made Granada rich almost immediately. It became the commercial engine of the whole colony, the place where the money lived. It's also, and you should remember this for later, the exact same feature that was eventually going to bring every pirate in the Caribbean rowing directly up to its front door. Great for trade, terrible for home insurance. The second city was León, founded the same year, though not where you'd find it on a map today. The original León sat near the base of the Momotombo volcano, a location somebody clearly chose for the scenery and not for the long-term structural planning. We'll get to why that mattered in a minute. For now, just picture two brand new Spanish cities going up almost simultaneously, one built for commerce on a lake with ocean access, the other built for administration in the shadow of an active volcano. If you're already sensing that these two cities were going to end up with very different personalities, you're ahead of the story, and also correct. While all this urban planning was happening, the indigenous population of Nicaragua was collapsing at a speed that's genuinely hard to process. Disease arrived first and did the most damage, because smallpox and its friends had never met these immune systems before and treated the encounter like a buffet. Warfare added its own body count on top of that, and then, layered over both of those horrors, came something historians consider one of the most aggressive indigenous slave trading operations anywhere in the Americas. Not one of the worst in Central America. One of the worst, period, anywhere colonizers ever set up shop. That's not hyperbole for the podcast. That's the actual historical assessment, and it deserves a paragraph of its own, because it's the part of this chapter that should genuinely stop you. Between roughly 1528 and 1540, historians estimate that around 200,000 indigenous Nicaraguans were rounded up and shipped out as slave labour, mostly south to Peru and Panama, to work mines and haciendas that desperately needed bodies. By the early 1530s, something like 15 to 20 ships were running this route full-time, out of a port called Rialejo, which briefly became one of the busiest slaving harbours on the entire Pacific coast of the Americas. Sit with that for a second. A country you may not have thought about twice before this video was, for about a decade, operating one of the most efficient human trafficking pipelines in the hemisphere, out of a harbour town most people have never heard of and will never hear of again after this sentence. Every one of those 200,000 people had a name, a family, a plot of land, a life that had nothing to do with Spanish silver quotas. And then, for no reason they chose, all of that got loaded onto a boat. Picture it the way this show always insists on picturing things. You, specifically, standing in your own village one morning with your family and your usual chores, and by that afternoon, you're in a coastal holding pen waiting for a ship toward a mine you'll never walk home from. That happened to 200,000 people. Not as a metaphor, as the actual recorded business model of an entire colonial province for roughly a decade. The trade only wound down toward the end of the 1540s, and it wound down for two reasons, neither of them merciful. Demand eventually cooled, and there simply weren't enough Nicaraguans left alive to keep exporting. That second reason is doing a lot of quiet, horrifying work in that sentence. Let it sit there for a moment before we move on. Meanwhile, back with our city-founding conquistador, Hernández de Córdoba had built two thriving settlements, stabilized the territory, and apparently decided this entitled him to run the place without Pedrarius looking over his shoulder. In 1526, he made moves toward claiming more independent authority for himself, reportedly with quiet backing from Hernán Cortés, which is the 16th century equivalent of taking a private meeting with your boss's biggest rival. Pedrarius found out. Pedrarius did not do subtle. He marched an army up from Panama, had Hernández de Córdoba arrested for treason, and had him beheaded in the plaza of the very city he'd built, with the head left on display as a public service announcement. The man who founded Granada and León didn't get to enjoy either of them for very long. Nicaragua later named its currency the Córdoba in his honor, which is either a lovely tribute or the darkest possible inside joke, depending on your mood. Pedrarias, for what it's worth, didn't outlive his victim by much in the grand scheme of things, dying a handful of years later, presumably still governing the way he did everything else. But the two cities he'd effectively inherited by murdering their founder kept right on developing separate identities, and this is where Nicaraguan history really finds its groove. Granada, with its lake, its river trade, and its Caribbean shipping lanes, grew rich, aristocratic, and conservative, the kind of city where old money looked down its nose at everybody else. León, landlocked and administrative, grew into the intellectual and political capital, eventually a university town, the place that leaned liberal and saw itself as the brains of the whole operation. One city had the money, the other had the opinions. You can guess how well that combination tends to go. If this is sounding familiar, it should. Back in the last chapter, we established that pre-Columbian Nicaragua was never one unified empire, just a patchwork of rival chiefdoms eyeing each other like feuding neighbours. Congratulations! Colonization did not fix that. It just replaced the chiefdoms with two Spanish cities and swapped tribal rivalry for civic rivalry, and this new version of the grudge was going to prove even more durable. Granada versus León became the default operating system of Nicaraguan politics, a rivalry that would flare into open civil war repeatedly over the following 3 centuries, well into the 1800s, long after Spain itself had left the building. 2 cities, 1 country, and a grudge with genuinely impressive staying power. But León had its own problem to deal with first, and it's the one we teased a few minutes ago, that volcano. In 1610, after decades of rumbling and a series of earthquakes, Momotombo finally had enough and buried the original city, León Viejo, under ash and lava. The survivors packed up and relocated about 30 kilometers northwest, founding the León that still exists today, while the old site was abandoned completely, left to be swallowed by jungle for the next 3.5 centuries. Nobody dug it back up until 1967. By 2000, it had earned UNESCO World Heritage status, which is the modern world's polite way of admitting, yes, that volcano really did just eat an entire Spanish colonial capital, and we should probably preserve the evidence. Granada, meanwhile, was busy discovering the downside of that gorgeous river access to the Caribbean. In 1665, the English privateer Henry Morgan, of eventual spiced rum label fame, rowed a small fleet of canoes straight up the San Juan River, caught the city completely unprepared, torched the waterfront, sank the ships in the harbour, and made off with a genuinely staggering haul of silver. The Spanish response was to build a fortress, the Immaculate Conception, guarding the river route, finished around 1675, complete with cannons, a garrison, and presumably a great deal of nervous glancing downstream. It helped. It did not fully work. In 1685, another English buccaneer, William Dampier, simply found a way around it and burned Granada down anyway. The city's whole economic advantage, that direct highway to the Caribbean, turned out to double as an open invitation for anyone flying a skull and crossbones, arriving roughly on schedule every generation or so like an extremely unwelcome relative. And while Granada was busy repelling pirates and León was busy digging out from under a volcano, an entirely separate situation was unfolding on the Caribbean coast, one Spain never really got a handle on. English interests, allied with the Miskito people we introduced at the end of the last chapter, turned that entire coastline into what amounted to a British client kingdom, the Miskito Coast. For close to 2 centuries, Spanish maps might have coloured that territory as part of Nicaragua. Reality disagreed. For roughly 200 years, the Caribbean side of the country ran on British influence, Miskito kingship, and essentially zero input from either Granada or León, which meant Nicaragua spent its entire colonial period not fully controlling its own coastline. Two rival Spanish cities squabbling over half a country, and a foreign crown quietly running the other half. That's a loose end that is absolutely going to matter again. Add it all up and you get roughly 3 centuries of Spanish rule sitting on top of a country that was never really unified to begin with. Two rival Spanish cities glaring at each other from opposite ends of a lake, a Caribbean coastline effectively run by a foreign power the whole time, and a colonial economy whose founding chapter had literally been built on shipping the local population away in boats. That is not a stable foundation. That is a country with several very old, very specific grudges just waiting for an excuse. And empires, as a general rule, eventually run out of reasons for the people underneath them to keep cooperating. By the early 1800s, Spain's grip on the whole region was loosening for reasons that had very little to do with Nicaragua specifically, and everything to do with Spain having bigger problems back in Europe. Independence was coming, and when it arrived, it was not going to solve the Granada-León rivalry. If anything, it was about to hand that rivalry an entire national government to fight over instead of just a lake. And that rivalry, it turns out, was patient enough to wait for an even stranger complication. An American adventurer who was going to show up a few decades later, invite himself in, and try to make himself king of a country he'd known for about a year. We are getting to him. Try to contain yourselves. Chapter 4. The Man Who Bought a Country and Forgot to Read the Fine Print. Right. Independence. You'd think that would be the happy part, the part where the colonizers pack up, everybody breathes out, and the country gets on with being a country. Nicaragua did get its independence from Spain in 1821, as part of a general Central American walkout, the whole region deciding, more or less simultaneously, that it was done taking orders from Madrid. But independence, in this particular neighborhood, was less a finish line and more a costume change. Nicaragua spent a confusing minute attached to the First Mexican Empire, which collapsed almost as fast as it formed, and then joined a regional experiment called the Federal Republic of Central America. 5 countries trying to run one government together. That lasted until 1838, when the Federation fell apart and Nicaragua struck out fully on its own. Freedom, it turned out, mostly just meant nobody was left to blame but each other. And each other, as you already know if you sat through the last chapter, meant Granada and León, and that grudge did not need a running start. The conservatives of Granada and the liberals of León had spent 3 centuries perfecting their mutual dislike under Spanish rule, and the instant the Spanish crown stopped being a common enemy, that old rivalry walked right back onto centre stage like it had never left. Civil war became the default setting of Nicaraguan politics. Through the 1840s and into the 1850s, one government toppling into the next, Granada and León trading control like 2 roommates who both insist they paid the electricity bill. It's exhausting, just to summarize. Imagine actually living through it. And normally this is the part of a country's history where a show like this politely moves along to the next couple of decades. Not this time, because this is the chapter where an unrelated goldfield in California reaches across an entire continent and makes Nicaragua's civil war catastrophically more interesting. Here's the mechanism, and it's more elegant than you'd expect. In 1849, gold turned up in California, and suddenly tens of thousands of Americans on the East Coast needed to get to the West Coast fast, in an era before airplanes, before a transcontinental railroad, before pretty much anything convenient existed. Sailing all the way around the tip of South America took months. But Nicaragua offered a shortcut, a boat up the San Juan River, a cruise across Lake Nicaragua, and a short overland hop to the Pacific, faster than the alternative route through Panama. An American businessman named Cornelius Vanderbilt looked at that map and saw exactly what you'd expect a man like Vanderbilt to see. In 1851, he launched the Accessory Transit Company, moving prospectors across Nicaragua by steamboat and stagecoach, at its peak ferrying something like 2,000 paying passengers a month. A quiet lakeside country had just become a toll booth on the road to instant wealth. So picture the state of play by 1855. Nicaragua is broke, exhausted, and still mid-brawl between Granada and León, except now that same stretch of river and lake is suddenly one of the most valuable pieces of transit real estate on the planet. And the liberals of León, having spent years losing ground to the conservatives, decide they need an edge. Not more troops from home, not a better general. They decide, and you should sit with the sheer confidence of this decision for a second, that what they need is to hire an American. Specifically, a small, soft-spoken, Tennessee-born lawyer, doctor, and journalist named William Walker, along with a band of armed volunteers he recruited in San Francisco under the charmingly bureaucratic label of immigrants. 58 of them sailed south in May of 1855. It is, with the full benefit of hindsight, one of the worst hiring decisions in the history of the Western Hemisphere. Walker did not arrive as some towering action hero. He was slight, quiet, unnervingly calm, and his own men reportedly called him the grey-eyed man of destiny, which is either the coolest nickname in this entire series or a 5-alarm warning sign, and it turns out to have been both. What he lacked in size he made up for in audacity. Within months of landing, Walker pulled off a genuinely startling manoeuvre. He loaded his mercenaries onto a captured Accessory Transit Company steamboat, crossed Lake Nicaragua at night, and took Granada, the conservative stronghold, almost entirely by surprise. By October of 1855, the city that had survived Henry Morgan, William Dampier, and roughly 200 years of pirates had fallen to a foreign mercenary with barely a shot fired. The liberals who'd hired Walker to help them win the war got exactly that. What they did not get was Walker ever intending to hand the country back. For a while, Walker ran things through a puppet, a Nicaraguan named Patricio Rivas installed as president while Walker quietly held the actual guns. That arrangement lasted about as long as you'd guess. In July of 1856, Walker organized an election that hit every note of a rigged election, right down to the suspiciously tidy results, and declared himself president of Nicaragua. And here's the detail that should genuinely stop you. The United States, under President Franklin Pierce, formally recognized Walker's government as the legitimate authority in Nicaragua. An American mercenary had shown up, borrowed a civil war as his entry point, crowned himself head of state, and his own home country nodded along and sent an ambassador. If a rogue tech founder tried this exact playbook on a small nation tomorrow, it would be the only story on the internet for a year. Now, presiding over an actual country requires an actual plan, and Walker's plan is where this story goes from audacious to genuinely horrifying. Central American nations had abolished slavery decades earlier, back in the 1820s, as one of the first orders of business after independence from Spain. Walker, angling hard for financial and political backing from the slaveholding American South, reversed that outright. In September of 1856, he issued a decree reinstating slavery in Nicaragua and declared English the official language of the country. The long game here wasn't subtle. Turn Nicaragua into an English-speaking, slave-holding territory, then engineer its annexation to the United States as a new slave state, tipping the balance in Washington's simmering fight over slavery's expansion. He wasn't freelancing. He was trying to manufacture, from a hijacked Central American republic, a brand new front in America's own coming civil war. You can probably guess how the neighbours felt about a hostile foreign regime next door proposing to become a permanent slave colony. For the first time in recorded memory, Central America stopped fighting itself entirely and turned, as one, on William Walker. Costa Rica moved first and moved hardest. Guatemala sent troops. Honduras sent troops. El Salvador sent troops. This joint campaign got its own name, the National War, and it is genuinely rare, in a region this fractured, to watch 4 separate governments agree on anything, let alone agree fast enough to mobilize armies. Walker had done what 300 years of Spanish rule, pirate raids, and volcanic eruptions never managed. He'd united Central America, just not in the way any reasonable person running for office would put on a campaign poster. And then Walker managed to also lose his own investors, which is an impressive trick given he was already fighting 4 countries at once. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the man whose transit company had practically ferried Walker's mercenaries to Granada in the first place, discovered that 2 of his own business partners had cut a side deal with Walker while Vanderbilt was travelling abroad, and Walker seized the entire accessory transit company and handed it to them. Vanderbilt does not appear to have taken this personally in a small way. He funneled money and support toward the Costa Rican war effort specifically to strangle Walker's supply lines and transit access. Picture the single richest, most vindictive man in America deciding, essentially on principle, to help finance a foreign war because someone stole his ferry company. That's not a metaphor for the Gilded Age. That's just Tuesday, 1856, for Cornelius Vanderbilt. By late 1856, the war had turned hard against Walker, and his forces were pushed back into Granada, the very city his surprise raid had won him more than a year earlier. Facing a coalition army closing in and unable to hold the city, Walker made a decision that still gets discussed in Nicaragua today with a kind of disbelieving anger. Rather than let Granada fall intact to his enemies, he ordered it burned to the ground. His lieutenant, Charles Frederick Henningsen, oversaw weeks of systematic destruction through November and into December of 1856, torching a city that had survived Henry Morgan's cannons and Dampier's raiders and 3 centuries of Spanish colonial life. Before the last of his men withdrew, they staged a mock funeral procession. Soldiers dressed as priests carrying a coffin labelled simply Granada, and buried it in the central plaza beneath a sign reading, Aquí fu Granada. Here was Granada. Past tense, deliberately. Sit with that phrase for a second, because it's doing something more than describing rubble. Aquí fue. Granada isn't a battlefield report. It's a taunt, a piece of theatre aimed at an entire nation, staged by a man who'd arrived a year and a half earlier as a hired gun for one side of somebody else's civil war. This was a city that had been continuously inhabited and fought over since 1492 hadn't even happened yet in Spain's own memory. One of the oldest surviving colonial cities in the Americas, and Walker's men treated its destruction as a punchline worth staging a funeral for. If you ever wondered what pure spite looks like when it's given an army and a match, this is the historical footage. There is no polite way to soften that image, so this show isn't going to try. Walker's grip collapsed fast after Granada burned. Surrounded, outnumbered, and increasingly out of allies on every front, he surrendered to the United States Navy on the 1st of May, 1857, specifically to avoid falling into the hands of the Central American coalition he'd spent 2 years uniting against himself. The Navy shipped him home to the United States a free man, because apparently losing a stolen presidency and burning a city to the ground carried roughly the consequences of a parking ticket, provided you were an American citizen and the crime happened somewhere else. He was almost unbelievably welcomed back in parts of the American South as a hero. Within months he was already plotting his return, because nothing about the previous 2 years had convinced William Walker that Central American conquest was a young man's game he should probably retire from. It took 3 attempts, but the region finally settled things for good. Walker tried twice more to fight his way back into Central America and got turned back both times before he ever secured real ground. His third and final attempt landed near Trujillo, on the coast of Honduras, in August of 1860, with barely more than 90 men behind him, a shadow of the force that once took Granada. A British warship intercepted the operation, and rather than let Walker slip away again, the British handed him directly to Honduran authorities. On the 12th of September, 1860, Honduran soldiers marched him through a crowd in Trujillo and stood him in front of a firing squad. The grey-eyed man of destiny died exactly the way you'd script it if this were fiction, except it wasn't. And Central America had waited a long 5 years for that particular ending. The scars didn't close when the bullets did. The national war left an anti-American suspicion baked into Nicaraguan and Central American politics that would echo for generations. Because when the most powerful country in the hemisphere recognizes a slave-holding mercenary as your legitimate president, that's not the kind of thing a nation quietly forgets. Inside Nicaragua, the war produced one clear domestic winner. Granada's conservatives, having borne the literal ashes of the conflict, emerged from it with the political capital and the exhaustion-fueled goodwill to dominate the country almost uncontested for the next 36 years, from 1857 all the way to 1893. After decades of civil war and one deeply unwelcome foreign president, Nicaragua finally got something resembling stability. It just came at the cost of Granada, and at the cost of learning exactly how far a foreign power would go when it smelled opportunity. Which, as it happens, is a lesson Nicaragua was going to need again sooner than anyone would have liked, because the peace the Conservatives built on Walker's ashes was never going to last forever, and the next foreign power with an interest in that same lake, that same river route, and that same strategic sliver of land between 2 oceans was not going to bother hiring a middleman at all. It was going to send Marines. Chapter 5. The Marines Who Wouldn't Leave and the Family Who Never Did. So, Marines. Let's talk about how that actually started, because it didn't start with an invasion so much as with one very stubborn Nicaraguan president refusing to take a hint. His name was José Santos Zelaya, a liberal who'd been running the country since 1893, and to be fair to him, he did a lot of genuinely impressive modernizing while he was at it. Railroads, schools, a more centralized state, the whole 19th century nation-building checklist. But Zelaya also had a habit of governing like the rules were more of a suggestion, and he had one specific idea that Washington found unforgivable. He started courting Germany and Japan about building a rival canal through Nicaragua. The United States had just sunk a fortune into Panama. It did not want competition. It especially did not want competition backed by 2 rising foreign powers with their own Pacific ambitions. That's the kind of thing that gets a president quietly marked for removal, and Zelaya got the full treatment. Washington leaned on his opponents, funded rebels, and waited. In October of 1909, a revolt broke out on Nicaragua's Caribbean coast, and when 2 American mercenaries fighting for the rebels were captured and executed on Zelaya's orders, the United States used it as the pretext to sever diplomatic relations entirely. Facing a rebellion with an increasingly hostile superpower standing behind it, Zelaya folded. He resigned on December 16th of 1909 and fled to Mexico, and Nicaragua's brief experiment in telling Washington no came to an abrupt and permanent end. The lesson, in case anyone in the region had missed it, was blunt. You could modernize your country however you liked. You just couldn't threaten the neighbor's shipping lane while doing it. What followed Zelaya wasn't stability. It was several years of the exact same conservative versus liberal chaos Nicaragua had been running on since independence, except now with an added ingredient. In 1912, facing another uprising, the conservative government invited the United States to send troops, and on August 4th of that year, American Marines landed to prop it up. It was billed, as these things always are, as temporary, a quick stabilizing visit in and out. It turned into an occupation that ran, with one brief pause, all the way to 1933, 21 years give or take, which is a strange kind of temporary. Imagine a house guest who says they're just staying for the weekend and is still there when your kids graduate high school, still eating your food, still using your Wi-Fi password. That was the American military presence in Nicaragua, and everybody involved more or less stopped pretending otherwise after year 3. While the Marines settled in, Washington finished off the canal question for good, and this is where Chapter 1's opening promise gets its answer. In 1914, the United States signed the Bryan Chamorro Treaty with the Nicaraguan government it had just helped install, permanently granting America exclusive rights to build a canal through Nicaragua and leasing naval bases on the Corn Islands and in the Gulf of Fonseca. In exchange, Nicaragua received $3 million. Most of that money never actually reached Nicaragua's treasury. It went straight to paying off American creditors, under the supervision of American financial advisors who were, conveniently, also running the country's customs revenue. Nicaragua sold the one geographic asset that had shaped its entire history for a sum smaller than what some Panama Canal contractors spent on payroll in a single month, and never got to build the thing anyway. Here's the part that should sting a little more than it usually gets credit for. The whole reason foreign powers had circled Nicaragua for a century, going back to the filibusters and the gold rush steamboats, was this one river and lake route between two oceans, and the Bryan Chamorro Treaty didn't just fail to deliver a canal. It was specifically designed to make sure nobody else ever built one there either, locking the rights away in an American vault where they'd sit unused for decades. Panama got the canal, the jobs, the shipping fees, the permanent global relevance. Nicaragua got a one-time payment mostly redirected to its own debts and a permanent American veto over its own geography. It's the diplomatic equivalent of selling your house's development rights to your neighbor, specifically so no one, including you, can ever build on it. Meanwhile, the Marines weren't just standing around guarding customs houses. They were also building something meant to outlast them. A Nicaraguan security force called the National Guard, trained by Americans, equipped by Americans, and sold to everyone as a modern, professional, strictly apolitical alternative to the country's endlessly warring partisan militias. On paper, that's a reasonable idea. Get rid of the private armies, build one neutral institution loyal to the state instead of a party. In practice, handing one group in a deeply unstable country total control of all its guns tends to go about as well as you'd expect. The man Washington picked to eventually run this supposedly neutral force was a smooth, English-speaking, well-connected officer named Anastasio Somoza Garcia. Remember that name. This chapter has more use for him than anyone currently wants it to. Now, not everyone in Nicaragua was thrilled about a permanent American garrison, and in 1927, one liberal general in particular decided he'd had enough. The Americans had brokered a peace deal ending the latest civil war, and pretty much every faction leader signed on and went home. Augusto Sandino did not. Sandino looked at an agreement that left the Marines right where they'd been, and decided that wasn't peace. It was just occupation with better paperwork. So instead of disarming, he took a small ragtag band of followers up into the remote mountains of northern Nicaragua in a region called Las Segovias, and declared he'd fight the occupation until every last Marine left the country. Everyone assumed this was a gesture, a doomed one, made by a man with barely a few hundred men and no air force against the most powerful military on earth. It was not a gesture. For more than 5 years, from 1927 to 1933, Sandino ran a guerrilla campaign against thousands of United States Marines and the American-trained National Guard, using exactly the terrain advantage you'd expect. Mountains, jungle, ambush, disappear, repeat. He never had the numbers to win a conventional battle, and he never had to. He just had to keep not losing, indefinitely, in country that swallowed American patrols whole. Peasants fed his men. Word of a barefoot army, embarrassing the world's dominant power, spread across Latin America and back to sympathetic newspapers in the United States itself. This wasn't just a local nuisance anymore. It was, genuinely, one of the first sustained anti-imperialist guerrilla movements the hemisphere had seen, and it's exactly where the word Sandinista comes from, decades before anyone needed it again. And here's the thing that finally got the Marines out. Not a decisive battle, money. The Great Depression hit. Washington's appetite for funding an endless jungle manhunt evaporated along with everyone's savings. And by 1933, the calculation shifted from, we can win this, to, can we afford to keep trying? On the 2nd of January 1933, the last Marines withdrew, having spent over 5 years and a great deal of American blood and money failing to hunt down one Nicaraguan general in his own mountains. Sandino had done what no army in the region had managed. He'd made a great power to decide leaving was cheaper than staying. Left behind as the parting gift was the National Guard, now the only organized armed force in the entire country, commanded by that smooth officer you were told to remember, Anastasio Somoza Garcia. With the Marines finally gone, Sandino agreed to negotiate, and in 1933 he struck a peace deal with the new Nicaraguan president, Juan Bautista Sacasa. He'd disarm most of his fighters, keep a small personal guard, and take a grant of land to farm with his remaining veterans. It looked, for one brief and genuinely hopeful stretch, like Nicaragua might actually get to move on. It didn't. On the night of February 21st, 1934, Sandino dined with President Sacasa at the presidential palace in Managua, a cordial, formal, everything is fine kind of dinner. As Sandino and 2 of his generals left the grounds afterward, National Guard officers arrested them on the road. Somoza had ordered it without telling the president whose dinner it was. There was no trial. There was a car ride to an airfield, a firing squad, and an unmarked grave. Sit with that for a second, because it deserves more than a footnote. This was a man who had spent 5 years surviving the most powerful military in the hemisphere in open mountain warfare, who then chose to trust a peace process, disarm, and take up farming. And he was murdered anyway, on the orders of the very security force the Americans had built to keep Nicaragua stable. The betrayal wasn't incidental to Somoza's rise. It was the founding act of it. Somoza had just demonstrated, to anyone paying attention, that he controlled the only guns in the country and was entirely willing to use them against a sitting president's own guest list. President Sacasa, humiliated and powerless against the force he nominally commanded, held on for 2 more years before Somoza pushed him out entirely and rigged an election in 1936 that made the outcome a formality. Somoza Garcia was sworn in as president on New Year's Day of 1937, and what started then wasn't really a presidency. It was a family business with a flag. Estimates vary. but by the time it was all over, the Somozas personally controlled something like a fifth of Nicaragua's arable land, on top of airlines, shipping, cattle, cement, and enormous slices of everything else worth owning, to the point where people genuinely started calling the country Somoza's Hacienda, which is less a nickname and more an accurate job description. And through the whole Cold War stretch of this arrangement, Washington kept backing him, because a reliably anti-communist strongman with a firm grip on Central America was worth more to American policy than a functioning democracy. Franklin Roosevelt is often quoted supposedly saying of Somoza, "He may be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch." Historians can't actually verify he said it. It stuck around anyway, because it fits so well nobody wants to let it go. The dynasty, once started, did not stop cleanly. Somoza Garcia was gunned down in 1956 by a young poet from León named Rigoberto López Pérez, who infiltrated a social event, shot him at close range, and was killed on the spot by the president's guards. Somoza died of his wounds days later. If you were hoping the country might get its own escape route out of this at that point, it didn't, because Somoza had raised understudies. His son, Luis Somoza Debayle, stepped straight into the presidency, favouring a somewhat softer, more institutional style of control. When Luis died in 1967, that restraint died with him, and his younger brother, Anastasio Somoza Debayle, took over with none of Luis's patience for appearances, ruling through the National Guard exactly the way their father always had. Same family, same guns, a new decade of the same arrangement. You already know from earlier in this series what happened to Managua on the morning of December 23rd in 1972. What you don't know yet is what happened after the rubble settled, and it's arguably worse than the earthquake itself. International aid poured in from dozens of countries. Tens of millions of dollars worth of relief meant for a shattered capital and its terrified homeless population. Anastasio Somoza Debayle and his inner circle systematically diverted large portions of it, routing reconstruction contracts and supplies towards Somoza-owned companies and loyal National Guard officers instead of the people who'd actually lost their homes. Businessmen who'd tolerated decades of Somoza corruption because it was, at least, profitable for them, watched him now profiteer off of a national catastrophe that had killed thousands of their own neighbours, and something in the arrangement finally, permanently broke. That's the moment worth sitting on as this chapter closes, because it's the hinge the whole rest of the story swings on. The earthquake had already devastated Managua. The theft that followed devastated something else entirely. The quiet, decades-long bargain between the Somoza family and Nicaragua's own business class. The wealthy elite who'd long looked past the corruption and the assassinated general in exchange for stability and a cut of the profits. That bargain was over. Moderates who'd never so much as raised their voice against the dynasty started openly comparing notes with people they'd previously dismissed as radicals. The National Guard was still the only army in the country. The Somozas still owned everything worth owning. But for the first time since a poet's bullet in 1956, the dynasty had genuinely united its own country against it, and it had absolutely no idea how little time it had left. Chapter 6. Revolution, Contras, and the Return of the Strongman. So, a unified opposition, a furious middle class, and a dictator who had no idea how little time he had left. That's where we ended things, and it did not take long for the clock to run out. The group leading the charge called itself the Sandinista National Liberation Front, the FSLN, named after the guerrilla Somoza's father had murdered back in 1934. You do not name your revolution after a man your enemy assassinated unless you're planning to finish what he started. Through the 1970s, the FSLN grew slowly in the countryside, splintered into three factions who agreed on almost nothing except that the Somozas needed to go, and gradually recruited students, priests, farmers, and a startling slice of the Nicaraguan middle class. Guerrilla movements usually stay guerrilla movements. This one was about to become something else, and the man who lit the fuse wasn't even a Sandinista. His name was Pedro Joaquin Chamorro, editor of the opposition newspaper La Prensa and Somoza's most persistent thorn, and on the 10th of January 1978, gunmen pulled up beside his car and shot him dead in the street. Somoza blamed a disgruntled businessman. Nobody believed that, and the courts later implicated Somoza's own son. The killing detonated 2 weeks of rioting in Managua, and Chamorro's funeral became a march of tens of thousands that clashed violently with the National Guard. Here's the thing about killing your most famous critic in broad daylight. It answers the one question everyone had been quietly avoiding: whether this regime could still be reformed from the inside. As of January 1978, the answer was a very loud no. Over the following year and a half, the uprising stopped being a Sandinista project and became a national one. Business leaders who tolerated the Somozas for decades because the arrangement was profitable started bankrolling the opposition, instead always the tell that a dictatorship is finished. Not when the poor turn against you, but when the people making money off you stop pretending. The National Guard responded the way it always did, with airstrikes and mass arrests, at one point bombing entire sections of Managua and León as though the cities themselves were the enemy. It did not work. It never works. All it did was hand the Sandinistas a recruiting poster made of rubble, and by spring 1979, the guerrillas were marching on the capital. The National Guard, trained and equipped by the very country now watching its client collapse, folded faster than anyone expected. Anastasio Somoza de Bail resigned on the 17th of July, 1979, and did what dictators with private planes and offshore accounts always do. He left. First to Miami, then briefly the Bahamas, then Paraguay, landing in the good graces of fellow strongman Alfredo Stroessner, because dictators tend to know each other. It did not end well for him there either. In September of 1980, assassins ambushed his car on a street in Asunción and killed him, meaning the man who ordered a poet shot over his father's murder died the same way, in a car, on a street, for reasons someone else considered justice. History does love a rhyme. The Sandinistas marched into Managua 2 days after Somoza fled, and a new revolutionary junta took power, with a young commander named Daniel Ortega quickly rising to the top of it. The mood for about 5 minutes was genuinely euphoric decades of one family owning the country, over, just like that. If you'd told the crowds cheering that July that the new boss would still be running Nicaragua nearly half a century later, they'd have laughed you out of the plaza. Revolutions are very good at promising this time will be different. History just wants to know if you brought snacks, because it's heard this one before. Credit where it's due, the early Sandinista government did some genuinely remarkable things. The 1980 literacy campaign sent thousands of young volunteers into the countryside and slashed illiteracy dramatically in under a year, an achievement UNESCO itself praised. Land reform broke up huge chunks of the Somoza family's stolen estates and redistributed them to the peasants who'd worked the soil. Healthcare expanded. Rural clinics opened. For a brief window, this looked like a revolution that might actually deliver on the poster. If the story stopped here, this would be a much shorter, happier chapter and a much less useful one. Because the interesting part of every Nicaraguan chapter so far, has been what happens right after things start looking good. What happened was the instinct that eats every revolution eventually. The people holding the guns decided the guns should stay right where they were. Independent media got squeezed. Elections got postponed. The Sandinistas leaned hard into alliances with Cuba and the Soviet Union, taking in Cuban advisors and Soviet bloc weapons, roughly 90 minutes flying time from Florida. During the single most anxious decade of the Cold War, Washington, still nursing the wound of losing a client stated had propped up for half a century, did not take this well. Reagan took office in January 1981, already convinced Nicaragua was the next domino, and he was not inclined to wait and see. So Reagan authorized covert support for an armed resistance known as the Contras, short for counter-revolutionaries, trained and supplied out of bases in Honduras and Costa Rica. Here's the detail that should make you laugh before it makes you wince. A substantial share of the early Contra leadership was former National Guard officers, the same men who'd spent the 1970s bombing their own cities on Somoza's behalf. The United States had just watched one Nicaraguan army lose to the Sandinistas. Its solution was to rebuild a version of that same army and send it back in. Sometimes history isn't cyclical so much as it forgets to change the cast. What followed was 9 years of brutal civil war that killed somewhere near 30,000 Nicaraguans, wounded thousands more, and displaced hundreds of thousands out of a population of only around 3.5 million. Picture that ratio, roughly 1 in 10 people forced from their homes. Whole villages lived with the real possibility that any night could bring a raid, a burned crop, a son who didn't come home. This wasn't two armies meeting on a battlefield. It was a war fought mostly against civilians, in both directions, and it left a scar that outlasted every government that came after it. Congress eventually got squeamish and passed the Boland Amendment, banning further US military aid to the Contras, the part where the Reagan administration should have simply stopped. Instead, the National Security Council secretly sold weapons to Iran, yes, that Iran, and funneled the profits to the Contras, which is both staggeringly illegal and an impressively brazen way to launder a foreign policy. It came apart when a Contra supply plane got shot down in 1986, and investigators started pulling threads. Oliver North became a household name, officials got convicted, and the affair remains one of the strangest footnotes in American foreign policy, a proxy war partly financed by arms sales to a supposed mortal enemy. Meanwhile, the country absorbing all this, the one people kept fighting over rather than for, was falling apart economically. A US trade embargo starved Nicaragua of markets for most of the decade. The war ate the budget alive, and by the late 1980s, inflation had spiraled into the thousands of percent, the kind of number where prices change between entering a shop and reaching the register. By decade's end, Nicaragua was poorer and more exhausted than at any point since the Marines first landed. Everyone involved had technically won some battles. Nobody had won the country. Then, in February of 1990, something happened that essentially never happens in Cold War Latin America. The revolutionary government held a genuinely competitive, internationally monitored election and lost. Violeta Barrios de Chamorro, widow of the murdered editor who opened this chapter, beat Ortega decisively, and Ortega, to his considerable and lasting credit, conceded. A revolutionary government that had fought a 9-year war to stay in power looked at the results, shrugged, and handed over the keys. That's rarer in 20th century history than you'd think. Briefly, though, because the outgoing Sandinistas had one more trick up their sleeve on the way out the door. Between the election loss and the April handover, Sandinista officials pushed hasty legislation transferring enormous amounts of state property, houses, farms, factories, vehicles, into the hands of party leaders and friends, in a scramble so blatant it earned its own nickname, the Piñata. Ortega himself, his brother, and several top commanders walked away owning a startling amount of prime real estate. The state later paid out well over $1 billion in compensation to sort out the mess. A genuinely funny name for a genuinely unfunny practice, a revolution that spent a decade denouncing Somoza for treating the country as his personal inheritance, wrapping up by grabbing party favours on the way out the same door. Ortega then spent 16 years losing elections and rebuilding, and won the presidency back in 2006 with only about 38% of a badly split opposition vote. The comeback strategy was a masterclass in doing whatever it takes. He cut a deal with the Catholic Church, backing a total abortion ban with no exceptions for the Cardinal's public blessing, while a fractured opposition split its vote across several tickets, leaving his minority the largest slice. The revolutionary who'd cozied up to Havana came back to power arm in arm with the church hierarchy he'd once sparred with. Politics makes strange bedfellows, and Ortega has never been shy about picking the bed. From there, the consolidation was steady and, honestly, textbook. Loyal courts reinterpreted term limits out of existence. The legislature and electoral council filled with people who owed Ortega their careers. His wife, Rosario Murillo, became vice president in 2017 and, after a constitutional overhaul, was elevated in February of 2025 to co-president, a title invented for the occasion, putting her alongside her husband as joint head of state. Nicaragua is, as of this recording, the only country on earth run by a governing couple with matching titles, a charming quirk of design. If it weren't the mechanism through which one family quietly reacquired the country, their revolution had overthrown another family for owning. In April of 2018, the government announced cuts to social security benefits, and Nicaraguans, especially students, poured into the streets. What followed was not politics as usual. Police and armed pro-government groups met peaceful demonstrators with live ammunition and, in places, snipers on rooftops. Over the following months, the crackdown killed more than 300 people, injured over 2,000, and pushed more than 50,000 into exile. Human rights investigators documented torture. This is not a moment for a punchline, and I won't reach for one. A government born from an uprising against a dictatorship that machine-gunned its own protesters spent 2018 doing exactly that to its own people, and there is no clever way to soften that, so I won't try. The repression has not let up. Ahead of the 2021 election, the government arrested essentially every credible opposition candidate, including a Chamorro family member, and Ortega won a fourth term unopposed in any real sense. In 2023, the government released over 200 political prisoners onto flights to the United States. Then, the same day, stripped their citizenship as traitors, later extending that to roughly 300 more dissidents, journalists and writers, rendering them officially stateless. Which brings us, uncomfortably, to the present. Just this month, in July of 2026, Ortega announced Nicaragua would simply stop holding elections, cancelling the votes scheduled for next year and dropping even the pretense of competition. Analysts have started placing Nicaragua alongside Cuba and Venezuela as one of the most closed, tightly controlled authoritarian states in the Western Hemisphere, a country that fought off a Spanish empire, a set of feuding city fathers, an American canal ambition, a decades-long military occupation, and a family dynasty, only to arrive, by a different road, at another family running the whole show indefinitely. And that, honestly, might be the real thread running through this 6-chapter story. Nicaragua keeps producing people who are furious and correct, about one family or one guard running the country for everyone else's benefit but their own. Walker crowned himself president. Zelaya ran the country like his personal project. Sandino fought a private army for years and got a peace dinner and a bullet for his trouble. The Somozas ran a family business with a flag. And the movement that finally overthrew them, the one named after that murdered guerrilla, spent decades insisting it was different, right up until it wasn't. Maybe that's not a Nicaraguan curse so much as a human one. Wanting the cycle to end is not the same thing as ending it. And on that reflective note, that's Nicaragua, start to finish, volcanoes and revolutions and all. Thank you so much for spending these 6 chapters with us. If you made it this far, especially if you made it this far half asleep, I appreciate you more than you know, and I'd love to hear in the comments where in the world you're listening from tonight. If you enjoyed the ride, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next country on the list. Until then, get some rest. You've earned it. Good night.